So I want to ask in this video what new progressivism has ever achieved on YouTube, but also on Twitter and Facebook, on social media generally, I suppose. And this comes on the back of a question that Captain Andy had asked about what has YouTube atheism ever achieved. In the first part of this little two-parter, I addressed that question from Captain Andy. So in many ways, this functions as a response and as a question to Captain Andy, but it also goes out wider, right? If you are somebody who has championed the causes that Captain Andy champions, especially if you've championed them in the same kind of way that Captain Andy advocates, then the question is especially pertinent to you. Now, why have I used the term new progressivism? I gave a bit of a hint in the first section of the video where I addressed Captain Andy's complaints with regard to YouTube atheism, but let me try and explain it here. There's two reasons why. The first reason is that I didn't want to use a term that might be regarded as a pejorative term. If I was to use a term like regressive leftism or anti-SJWism, then rightly in some way somebody like Andy could say, well, I don't acknowledge those terms, or you're prejudicing the conversation to begin with by using those terms, right, which are kind of put downs. So I wanted to have a more neutral term, and I also wanted to tie it in. He talked about YouTube atheism, and YouTube atheism was founded in many ways, partly as a result of when YouTube started, but on the back of this sort of invention of the press, which was new atheism. And what new atheism was about wasn't necessarily about atheism, really. It was about anti-theism. It was about going out there and criticizing religion or challenging religion for one reason or another. But it was a more vociferous brand of it. It was a slightly more hardline brand, a more direct brand, a more offensive brand, perhaps, a more crude brand. And that's what it went out there to do. And did it achieve anything or didn't it? Well, that's a different question. But that's how I view new progressivism, as having the same kind of relationship to progressivism. In many ways, the goals are exactly the same. Some of the goals might be more radical. They may go further. They may stretch credulity for some of us. But most of the central goals are the same goals as the progressive goals that were already in place. But it's a much more strident approach. And so that's the question that I want to ask. What has that achieved? Now, I'm asking that question. You can stop the video there and you can answer it. But I'm going to do what Andy did in his video, which was to give his views on some of these things. So I want to give my views and get them out there with regard to these issues. What I would say is that, as I've said to Andy in an exchange on Facebook, I'm a gradualist, and I see very much merit in a gradualistic approach to social change that happens at a pace where you can get people on board as much as possible rather than twisting their arms, and a pace that takes place organically in many ways. You set the seeds, you make the arguments, and then you allow society to change. And that kind of progressivism, from my perspective, seemed to be doing very well. Now, I know somebody like Andy might say, yes, from your perspective, society's fine because it's all centered around you. That isn't what I mean. I don't mean with regards to things that benefit me. I mean, in many ways, things that don't benefit me. Things such as, in my lifetime, Andy, in fact, not in my lifetime. We're not even talking my lifetime, because I'm only halfway through my lifetime. So in half a lifetime, the changes that I've seen with regard to attitudes towards homosexuality in the United Kingdom, towards attitudes to do with race in the United Kingdom, are mind-shatteringly different, how these things have changed. And if I think back to things that I'd watch and things that I'd hear and attitudes that were commonplace when I was a child, it is revolutionarily different now to what it was then. I can also say with regard to sex and gender and how we view women, for example, in the workplace, in one generation, my wife's mother, same with my mother, both left work when they had children and became a housewife because that is what happened then. Within one generation, my wife, now we've had a child, there was never any question of her leaving work. That was never even a consideration. The assumption is that she would stay working, and stay working in a more prestigious job than I have, right? Now that wouldn't, the chances of that being the scenario back at the time when just going back one generation is very, very small. How different the change in situation and how different the change in perceptions just within one generation. And I regard those as quite organic and gradualistic changes that have taken place, and yet still at a very, very rapid rate if you compare the kind of social change that has often taken place in societies in the past, often which has taken many, many generations and sometimes centuries for social changes to work through. But seemingly that hasn't been good enough for some people, and there's this the drum beat started some time ago. And if you could set that drum beat to some kind of, I don't know, like some union placard, Andy, I'm sure you've been on a few picket lines in your time, I've been on a couple as well, it would say something like, what do we want? Everything. When do we want it? Now. Something along those lines. And I first came across this with regard to the fabled now, it's kind of YouTube legend in these parts, Free Thought Blogs, Atheism Plus, fiasco, I have to say. And at the time, it seemed like this was an isolated thing. But of course it wasn't an isolated thing. And this was just one tendril. From my perspective, from my little blinkered perspective there, it seems as if this has spread from this little avenue of the internet through to everything in society, seemingly in the space of 3 or 4 years. But of course that wasn't the case. These little tendrils were coming up all over the place, and this has just been the little localized understanding that I've had of that scenario. But that really didn't work out very well, did it? For all the goals that they had, all that they seem to have done is isolated themselves. If you look back at Skepticon, which was very much the most left-wing of these kinds of skeptic conventions, it went from attracting more and more people every year and being very, very popular. But it's like a kind of onion, constantly shedding off the least pious and devout layers, and all that's left now is a core, and it's a hollow shell of what that event was. If you go and look at what's taking place now, it's become their little socio-political backwater. With, if you look at the crowd, there's hardly anybody in it. It's really quite embarrassing to see what's taken place there. And what they seem to have done is to have isolated themselves rather than to have achieved everything. The whole thing seems to have gone horribly wrong. And in fact, in terms of Atheism Plus themselves, so devout were they that they set up this Atheism Plus forum, and it was such a hate-filled sack of shite that the Atheism Plus forum even started hating on the people that had set up the forum because they weren't devout enough, Andy. And I propose to you, Andy, that this is how things always tend to pan out. It just tends to sort of disappear up its own arse somewhat. It's like it's kind of like a Ouroboros the serpent getting things terribly, terribly wrong in some kind of way. But is it any wonder that it's going to work out in this kind of way? And then as these little tendrils, I saw this little tendril with the whole Free Thought Blogs, Atheism Plus, and then that seemed to spread onto YouTube, but of course that was coming from everywhere. And as a result of that, you know, I've heard you say several times now that one of the things that YouTube is this right-wing cesspool. This is what you say, and that this is very right-wing, all the sort of areas of YouTube that we're involved in. I can tell you that you wouldn't have said that back in 2008, 2010, you wouldn't have said that, you know. It was odd. When I started in 2008, I sat there as Mr. Boring Bastard, middle-of-the-road centrist, and nearly everybody that I knew on YouTube was to the left of me. Oh, that's how it appeared to me, that my politics was to the right of the vast majority of people that were involved in the YouTube circles that I was involved in. Not by a long way, most of them, but to the left of me. And I agree partly with what you say. It does seem to have shifted a great deal to the right. I feel now as if I'm like kind of slap bang in the middle now, perhaps sometimes to the left of the political centre. So what has caused that? What has affected that change, Andy? And when did it take place? Well, it seems to have coincided very, very much with this very, very aggressive, hardline New-Progressivism that seems to have abandoned trying to convince people and instead has decided to condemn people. And when has that path ever worked out well, Andy? You just tell me that. I mean, look, sure, if what you want to do is you want to play to the crowd, you just want to preach to the converted or just show off your credentials about what a great person you are, then that's great. But the problem is that you're not going to convert anyone. You're not going to convince anybody by condemning them. All you're ever going to do is harden their hearts. And I know that we had a bit of a discussion on Facebook and you threw this one back at me. And I'll give you the response now that I gave on there for the benefit of everybody else, which is it's fine. You can harden the hearts of a few. If you want to go after Stormfront, you can say what you like about them. I likened it to Christianity and atheism in the United States. If you want to say something that criticizes heavily all the atheists in the United States, you can get away with that trick because there's only about 10% of the population. But if you want to do the same thing and it's going to involve criticizing Christians, you're not really going to get very far because that's like 80 or 90% of the population that you're going to be criticizing there. You're not going to bring them on board. You're going to have to box a little bit more clever, I would suggest there, Andy. And this is the problem. It's that the condemnation has incorporated nearly everybody. And what has it resulted in? It's resulted in some of the most bizarre things I've ever seen. It's resulted in people talking fondly about Donald Trump that I wouldn't expect to do so in a million fucking years. People whose politics, when I listen to them in the round, seems to the left of me, who are prepared to put their flag alongside somebody such as Donald Trump. That is absolutely wild. That is bizarre, right? And if you're telling me that new progressivism isn't responsible for that, I'd like you to tell me what is. Because all these changes that I've seen on YouTube just seem to coincide with this new, very, very much hardline approach that has taken place. And I've seen that explicitly be the root cause of the problems that took place with regard to Atheism Plus and Free Thought blogs. So the understanding that can't possibly be responsible for some of what has taken place in the bigger cultural sphere, I find a little bit hard to take. But rather than picking your battles wisely, Andy, and you do need to pick your battles wisely, right? To go back to atheism in the United States, I think this is something that's been handled badly in some cases, in that atheists have sweated the small stuff. Andy, and again, this is something that we've discussed, that rather than picking on the things that really matters, that they've picked on some of the things that actually in countries like the United Kingdom, we've allowed these things. We've not had any separation of church and state. We've had nativity scenes in shopping centres, the works, and nobody's given a crap about it. And yet it's not caused a problem. If you try and make everything a battleground, all you do is you just harden people against your perspective. And actually most people do have a little bit of give, even to opinions that they don't necessarily agree with, because they realise we've all got to give a little bit. But if you look like the kind of people that are just going to pick on everything, people will just end up giving you absolutely nothing. And I think that this is what I've seen, is that rather than trying to pick the battles that need to be fought, everything's been a battleground, everything's been a problem, nothing can be let go, everything needs to be picked up on, everything needs to be changed. What do we want? Everything. And when do we want it? Right fucking now. And the perspective seems to be that if we don't go for that, well, how can I sit here and allow prejudice and bigotry to take place for another 5 minutes? You know, everything has to be solved right now. That's a marvellous moral position to take, Andy. But the problem is, if you end up setting things back even further, then maybe you'd be better to settle for my 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years than set them back even further than that, perhaps. And what I'd say I've seen, Andy, is this kind of position that's amounted to some kind of absolute socio-political piety, in which almost everybody, including the kind of people that you really do need to get on board if you're going to get a big enough consensus in society to do anything, have been labelled bigots in one capacity or another. And a result of that, all you've done is harden hearts and means that you're not getting a consensus on damn near anything. You're just pushing everybody away. That people are labelled bigots either on the grounds of something they've said or something they believe. Doesn't matter about the rest of what they are. They need to be condemned for that, and roundly condemned and solidly condemned, or even more radically, Andy, for some people, the condemnation, the bigotry that's being accused of, is due to some characteristic that is intrinsic to the person. That if you're white, then you are racist and there's nothing that you can do about it. That if you're a man, that you are intrinsically sexist, and it doesn't matter what you do, it doesn't matter what your views and your opinions are, it's just hard shit, you're racist and we're going to keep telling you you're racist, you know, as if we're getting some kind of a fucking buzz out of it. What I've got to say is, even if you believe that, and I'm not saying that's your particular position, but it's the position of quite a number of people, right? That even if that's your position, what is that ever going to achieve by saying that, other than doing incredible amounts of damage? Sure, you're going to have some people nodding their head in agreement and saying, yeah, I agree with you, all white people are racist. It's intrinsic that there's this subconscious racism that white people have that you just cannot get away from, blah-de-blah-de-blah. But phrasing it in those terms, what is that ever going to achieve positively? Does that mean that you will never convince anybody? Of course not. And I'm sure you can pick one or two things, one or two positives that have taken place in the last few years. But what I would say is that they have taken place absolutely and resolutely in spite of this kind of approach, and not because of this kind of approach. Okay, interested to know, Andy, what you have in response, what people who are like-minded to Andy have with regard to this question. What do you think this kind of new progressivism that we've seen in the last few years has achieved? I've told you what I think. What do you think?